Hello, everyone. Welcome to the brave new world of remote learning. Hope you're all staying safe, staying healthy, and that you're starting to settle in to the weird new reality that we're all living in right now. We're talking about population today, and there's actually a lot of connections between what we're discussing today and the way that the response to the coronavirus is unfolding. And while I wasn't going to talk a lot about it, I do hope that you'll be thinking about how what we're discussing today, we will be discussing in the next week, connects to things that we're seeing happen in the world. Because to me, in my mind, there's a huge connection between them. There's a big connection, a big parallel between how we address the current public health crisis and also what's on the table in terms of how we address climate change. Obviously, there's limitations to that parallel, but I'm seeing a lot of people making these connections. And I think that there's a lot to pay attention to there, even as we are cooped up at home, even as we are not going to be in direct contact with a lot of our community. So hopefully you're finding ways to stay in community and stay in touch with people that are normally in community with you, and that we together can find ways to continue to think about these things and keep that forward momentum going. So, we're talking about population today, and a lot of times you might hear issues around global population, particularly as they pertain to environmental issues, framed in terms of overpopulation. So before I move forward with the rest of this framing lecture, please think about what comes to mind when you hear the term overpopulation. Where do you think about overpopulation happening? Why do we even talk about it as overpopulation? Why do we think of it as being a problem? And also, what solutions are there if it is indeed a problem? Please actually go ahead and pause this video and just think about those questions for a minute. Jot down a few answers to them. Where do you think about population being growing the fastest? Why do you think it's a problem? Why do we talk about it like it's a problem? All right, let's continue. Keep that stuff in mind, because we're going to be circling back to it and hopefully interrogating some of the assumptions that we all have about population growth as it pertains to environmental issues. So before all the craziness that we're currently living through started to set in, we talked about energy, politics, and climate change. We talked about which actors stand to benefit from different types of climate policy options. We talked about what types of strategies and tactics and political organizing approaches different organizations, agencies, firms, governments, groups might use in order to secure the agenda that they want, to advance the agenda that favors them. In a sense, we were focusing on kind of the supply side of the question. What determines and shapes the political economy of energy, and who benefits from different types of structural changes to the economy? Today, by talking about population, we're really going to be addressing issues around consumption a little bit more. We're still very much going to have our eye on understanding the scale of the challenge and also solutions that might be out there that attend to really understanding the implications of population and demographic change for climate change. So I'm going to start by just giving you some facts and some background that help you think about population, and then move into some issues around how that helps us think about what options are on the table and what we can do with that as we analyze different policy options and different ideas for moving forward. So what's the general trend with population? Well, the world population is going up and up. If you look at this graph, since about 10,000 BC, population was pretty flat. As agriculture started to kick off, and especially urbanization and kind of specialization with metal and metalworking societies, we start to see population increase, getting us to around 1 million before really taking off after further imperial expansions in the first millennium AD, and ultimately really kicking into high gear into a sort of newfound exponential growth around the time of industrialization. And as you can see, it's just in the last couple hundred years that we've seen population globally skyrocket to upwards of 7 billion people now, from below 1 billion people just a little over a century ago, a couple centuries ago. So really rapid, unprecedented growth in a very short time. What's happening in the future? Well, it's hard to know completely, but projections that the United Nations have put it at continuing to go up, essentially, right? Seeing that graph continue to shoot up with a pretty much straight vertical line, potentially exceeding 10 billion or reaching 11 billion by the end of the century. So this is a really big deal. It's hard to predict exactly what shape that curve is going to take, and there's a lot of different factors that might influence it. Globally, it's about birth rates and death rates. Birth rates and death rates are the two factors that shape overall population growth. When the birth rate exceeds the death rate, population grows. At the local level, for countries and for specific localities, immigration and emigration also matter quite a bit as well. So demographers and people who study population often talk about something called the demographic transition. And basically what this refers to is how population has changed over time, or tends to change over time in societies that go through some kind of an industrialization process. So that kind of stage one that we've seen empirically, and this doesn't necessarily suggest anything normative about a progression towards something good or desirable, but rather just a description of how population change has been observed over time in different places. But in general, in agrarian societies with a lot of subsistence livelihoods where people tend to farm primarily and live in rural areas, you have really high birth rates and also really high death rates. The population is relatively stable under these conditions. Over time, as technology starts to increase and improve, death rates start to fall. People tend to move into cities, there tends to be more access to healthcare perhaps, some communicable diseases were eradicated, and you start to see death rates fall. But you still have a lot of people that live in rural areas that depend on agriculture, that have an economic situation that favors having really large families, that have cultural institutions or cultural norms that come out of those rural economies that favor large families. In these circumstances, this kind of second stage of the demographic transition that you can see here, we see massively increasing populations. Into that third stage, where birth rates remain high but start to fall slowly over time at different rates depending on a lot of different factors. This is not the same everywhere, it's important to note. Eventually in that fourth stage, we start to see birth rates really come down, perhaps meeting or even going below the death rate, at which point you might see populations start to decline. We see that in places like Italy, places like Japan, and potentially a fifth stage where birth rates start to come up a little bit again. So those are kind of the 5 stages of demographic transition. And depending on what happens between stages 3 and 5, we may see very different potential future worlds by the end of the 21st century. Another way to think about it, another sort of striking way to think about it, is in terms of how long it takes for the population to double. So this graph shows how fast the population has doubled over time. It took 697 years for the world population to double, from about 250 million in the year 837 to 500 million in 1543. Moving forward, you can see that that doubling time actually decreases over time, 594 years to double by 1737, just a couple of centuries doubling time by the 1800s. And by the 1900s, we're well below a century. The population in 1975 was twice what it was at the beginning of the century. And right around the year 2000, we start to see something curious happens. The population is still growing really fast, but the rate of growth is actually starting to decrease. We're starting to see that doubling time go up. We still very much might see the population double from the kind of late 20th century to 2088 if current projections hold. But again, it's hard to say because a lot could happen. So it's not really exponential growth in the sense that the growth rate has changed over time. And there's a pretty simple kind of convenient rule of thumb where you can stick your thumb out and squint at it to guess how long it'll take a population to double. Depending on the growth rate, you can just take the number 70, it turns out this way based on how kind of the calculus works out, and divide that by the growth rate. So for example, at a growth rate of 1%, the population will double every 70 years. At 5%, it just takes 14 years to double. And at 10% growth, it takes only 7 years for a population to double, right? So that's pretty staggering and gives you a sense of how to interpret percent growth. It doesn't just apply to population, it applies to a lot of things, really to any kind of exponential process. But like I just mentioned, population growth is not truly exponential because that growth rate is really changing over time. And right now it is globally going down. couple other terms that are useful to keep in mind. The total fertility rate. You'll see this term tossed around a lot, used a lot in global discussions about population, climate, and energy policy as it relates to demographic issues. The total fertility rate refers to the total number of children born or likely to be born to a woman in her lifetime if she were subjected to the prevailing rate of age-specific fertility population. The total fertility rate of about 2.1 children per woman is called the replacement level fertility. The replacement rate, or the replacement rate of around 2 basically means the population will replenish itself, remain stable. Another term is something called the dependency ratio. And that refers to the number of people who are too young or too old to work compared to the number of people who can work. So from the perspective of economics and also ecological analysis, it's not only important to understand or to know how many people live, how many people there are, but how old they are, what the distribution of ages is. And that dependency ratio, where you might have a lot of young people or a lot of old people, can really affect the workings of a society, of a country. If you remember this demographic transition curve, at stage 4 over here, kind of on that far end of it, when populations might actually be declining, that also means that you have an aging population. Countries like Italy and also Japan have had declining populations over time and increasingly aging populations, which means that there's not that many people who can work relative to the number of people who are older and not in the workforce anymore, which has big implications for maintaining a social safety net and maintaining public services and that kind of thing. All right. So again, this is kind of the history of population growth. And this is one potential future. But the specific trajectory that it's likely to take, I can move my face over there so you can see it a little better, whether we end up going to 11 billion or if this curve here ends up leveling off somewhere else, depends on a bunch of factors. And one of those factors that it depends on is this kind of population structure. How old are people in the country? And one useful tool in demography to understand this stuff is called a population pyramid. So this graph right here, this chart, shows the distribution of ages within a country. So this is China in 2016. You can see that there's a lot of people between the ages of like 25 and 50. There's actually not that many young people, in large part because of China's quote unquote one-child policy, which provided a bunch of institutional disincentives and policy disincentives to having more than one child since the 1970s. And not as many old people either. So you can kind of guess that most people are kind of in the workforce. There's a lot of people here that are of working age. You can also kind of guess at what might happen to the population in the future based on the shape of this graph. Here are 3 different countries with very different population structures. The DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, is undergoing rapid population growth. You can see that a lot of people there are very young, which means that people are at or going to enter into their kind of peak reproductive years pretty soon. The United States has slow growth. A lot of the growth in the United States has been due to immigration rather than the natural quote unquote birth rate in the last several decades. And Germany, which has an older population, has actually negative growth. And this is true in a number of places in Europe and also in Japan. Okay? So this is really important for understanding not just the present, but also the future trajectories of population. So this also has really big implications for how we use land on Earth. Agriculture in particular, and we've been talking a lot about agriculture, not just in recent history, but also since the advent of agriculture, really, when we were reading Ruddiman and learning about how rice irrigation started to modify the Earth's climate as long ago as maybe 6,000, 8,000 years ago. But since then, as population has grown even more rapidly, ever more rapidly, we've seen truly radical transformations of Earth's terrestrial landscapes. In this graph right here, you can sort of see where cropland is and where pasture land is, grazeland is. The greener an area is, the more occupied, the more covered in pasture it is. The yellower areas are covered in cropland. And you can see that it's pretty tremendous. Almost all of the Indian subcontinent is covered in cropland. You have a tremendous amount of pasture in South America and in sub-Saharan Africa. The United States, if you look at it, and also Europe, has an awful lot of cropland, especially kind of in the Midwest is where you really see dense croplands, along with quite a bit of pasture out west. And if you're from the West, you've probably seen a lot of that. If you're from the Midwest, you've probably seen a lot of agriculture. Now, the shape of agriculture and the form that it takes has changed an awful lot over time. We have earlier kind of forms of subsistence agriculture. This image right here depicts a sort of settler form of agriculture that involved different types of crops, not a lot of mechanization, slightly more diverse landscapes, potentially lower yield and production, but a lower kind of environmental impact overall. As populations grew, as technology changed, and as the economic system especially changed to favor the consolidation and kind of massive increase of yields over other types of objectives, we started to see even bigger, more profound changes. This is an image from the Midwest, and you can see kind of the big mechanized form of agriculture. With how many crops do you see here? Really just one, right? So there's often just one crop. In the United States Midwest, it's often corn or soy. In other places, there might be other types of crops as well that have come to just blanket massive swaths of the Earth's surface in ways that are remarkable in geological history. To have just a few crops covering so much of the Earth's surface, where previously there were biodiverse prairies, forests, and other types of ecosystems. So mechanized agriculture really did change everything. And this image right here shows how mechanized agriculture and new agricultural frontiers continue to change landscapes. This is a satellite image from the Amazon, and you sort of see in this picture taken in the 90s, I think, that there's a specific kind of pattern that you see. You start to see almost what's called a fishbone pattern of land use change, where there's kind of rows with patches of deforestation alongside them. And this reflects the way that frontiers are settled, which has been hugely impactful and remains hugely impactful for the world's forests. How much land are we using for agriculture? How much are we actually using to feed ourselves? Well, here's another striking image, I think, that shows the nature of our consumption patterns. Basically, the way to interpret this graph is the countries that are in orange basically tell you whether or not, if your country like the United States is in orange, what that means is that if everyone on Earth ate like the United States, had a diet similar to the average person in the United States, it would be impossible to feed the world's population with the amount of land or arable land that we have. Countries that are in green have a diet or consumption pattern such that they actually, if their habits were extrapolated to the rest of the world, we would be able to produce enough food for everybody. And the countries that are in kind of beige would require more land than is currently used for agriculture, but it would still be at least theoretically doable. And I think this is important to chew on because it starts to give us a window into who, in terms of our lifestyle habits, is using the most energy, or sorry, using the most land for feeding ourselves. All right. A couple other things that might surprise you: different types of foods, different types of contributors to people's diets, and there's a lot of people on Earth, have big implications for how much energy, how much water are being used. So it's not just land, it's also these other resources. Fruits and vegetables tend to use a lot of energy, not that high in emissions. Meat actually doesn't use as much energy, but due to the other emission sources from livestock, methane, et cetera, have really high greenhouse gas emissions and quite a bit of water use as well. If you take a look at this, and I'll post these slides, there might be some other pieces of information here that are surprising to you. Just a couple other ways to think about kind of the scale of population, because I think it is helpful to look at this a few different ways, because it's hard to wrap your head around these big numbers sometimes. But there are 17 humans on Earth per pigeons, of which there are 400 million. There are 10,000 humans per elephant, and 35,000 humans per chimpanzee. And again, when you think about livestock and think about the amount of domesticated animals on the planet, something that we talked about when we were covering biodiversity, it becomes increasingly striking that mammalian biomass, humans and domestic animals, take up almost the majority, the vast majority. Humans accounting for 30% of terrestrial mammalian biomass, domestic animals accounting for 67%, with just 3% of that biomass corresponding to wild animals, wild mammals. This is remarkable. It's another way just to understand the degree to which we have transformed Okay, a couple other ways, just going to throw a few more striking ways to think about population on the planet that I think is useful for everyone to have in mind as we understand, as we think about environmental policy and what it takes to deal with climate change as a global challenge, is that there are more people that live inside this circle, I'll move my face so you can see better, than outside of it, right? More people live in these countries, China, India, Japan, all the countries of Southeast Asia, Indonesia, the Philippines, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, then Nepal, several other countries down there too, then all of the rest of the world. So when we think about consumption and when we think about population, it really behooves us to be aware of this crucial fact of distribution, of where people are and where they might be, all right? A couple other ways to think about this stuff too. So this is a pretty cool data set made by a guy named Max Galka. You can find his stuff on metrocosm.com and play around with it to kind of see how stuff looks. Basically, it changes the size of countries on Earth corresponding with a variable that you pick. So let's take population first. If you were to adjust the size of countries to reflect their relative populations, you see Asia massively inflate. Europe contract a bit, the United States contract a bit, South America contract a bit. But this kind of shows, compared to the sort of rough, although this is a pretty distorted map, data projection type of thing, you can see how it shifts when we skew towards population. What about if we look at where population is growing? Is that going to be different? It is different in an important way. I'll do that again. So this is total population today, roughly today. And this is population growth. A major important thing that you see here that's different is sub-Saharan Africa. Those countries become bigger when we look at population growth. We anticipate population growth to continue and be extremely high in sub-Saharan Africa. It's very high in parts of Asia as well, but China shrinks in this kind of visualization, right? So that's important to keep in mind. This is another way to think about it, another way to look at it. Population growth is going to be really high in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, accounting for actually most of the population growth that we expect to see from 2012 out to 2050. And this has really big political implications too, so keep this in mind. What happens if we look at wealth? Well, all of a sudden we see almost the inverse type of map. Wealth is massively concentrated in the United States and North America, and in Europe. You'll notice that Japan is also pretty big. Hong Kong all of a sudden becomes visible on the map, etc. But overall, we see a really different kind of distribution here. Now, finally, what about emissions? Once again, you can see a different kind of map here. When we make countries when we size countries in accordance with their total carbon emissions, all of a sudden, sub-Saharan Africa becomes practically invisible. Those countries shrink massively when we try to look at how big countries are based on their total emissions. The United States is pretty big, China's pretty big. Sorry, I gotta rephrase that. This is emissions per capita, right? Emissions per person, okay? Still, you see that the United States is really big, Europe is pretty big, and a very different map than when you look at population growth rate. Okay, so population growth looks like this, personal wealth looks like this, emissions look something like that. Okay, and this tracks a lot with inequality, which we're going to have a subsequent lecture on, diving into the details of inequality in its various forms more in depth. But overall, the richest 10% of people on Earth are responsible for almost half of total lifestyle consumption emissions. And that's a really important thing to remember when you hear people talking about population growth and how it relates to climate change in particular. The poorest 50% of people on Earth are responsible for only around 10% of total lifestyle consumption emissions, right? So this is a large group of people that's largely not that responsible for global emissions. And a lot of these folks live in sub-Saharan Africa and in countries like India with huge populations and not a ton of per capita emissions. This is another graph of India that shows the kind of staggering population of India. I think it's useful just to have this in mind. It always shocks me every time I see it. But this map right here labels each state in the country of India after a country with a similar population. So you can see that the entire country of Brazil, the entire population of Brazil, would fit into, or basically is similar to the population of just this state of Uttar Pradesh. All of Japan, another incredibly populous country, is similar in population to the state of Maharashtra, right? So there's a lot of different states here with huge numbers of people that actually aren't contributing all that much to global emissions. And there's also quite a bit of disparity within India in terms of how much the population is growing. Most population growth in India is happening in the north, rather than in the south, where population growth rates are pretty low, if not negative. And that has a lot to do with the education of girls and women. With female literacy, it seems to track pretty closely with total fertility rate, and not necessarily as much to do with top-down government policies to limit how many children people are allowed to have, or cutting off access to resources and support if they do have too many kids. Instead, it's been really about family planning education and other types of education, and especially gender equity. Okay, so we're gonna pivot a little bit to thinking about how all of the kind of numbers and graphs that we just saw might help us to think about decarbonization and climate change. There's a typo there, decarbonization is spelled wrong, but if you remember this equation that we went over the other day in class, I'll remind you about it briefly. It's called the Kaya identity. And again, I think it's important to take this figure with a grain of salt, because it doesn't necessarily account for everything that we might be interested in when we think about decarbonization. But basically what it says is that the total emissions of an economy, the total CO2 emissions is really what we're talking about here, is a function of population, the GDP per capita, the amount of energy that you need to kind of generate each dollar of GDP, and the carbon intensity of your energy, right? How much emissions are you generating for each British thermal unit or whatever of energy that you're using, right? So solar is going to be better than wind. Solar is going to be better than coal, for example, right? So the implications of this way of looking at emissions are basically that there are 4 and only 4 ways to decarbonize an economy. You can reduce population, you can reduce GDP per capita, or at least reduce economic growth. You can make your economy more efficient, get more GDP out of less energy. And this is, by the way, the only term that sort of spontaneously decreases over time, just as firms seek to become more efficient in their operations for profit-seeking reasons, basically, and efficiency reasons. Or, finally, to make your energy more renewable and less emissions intensive. Those are the 4 and only 4 ways, according to this kind of framework, to decarbonize an economy. Now, one of the things that we talked about last time was this GDP term, and we'll circle back to that in a second. And we talked about some of the limitations of policies that don't think creatively about who benefits from GDP growth. And what we talked about in particular is the fact that GDP has grown in the US, for example. It's also true in other places, even as wages for most people have not. At the same time, in global environmental policy discussions, both population and also GDP tend not to be discussed. However, you will hear a lot of people talking about population and overpopulation, quote unquote, as a major issue, a major barrier to dealing with climate change. The fact that there's so many people on the planet presents, in this view, a fundamental barrier to reducing our emissions as a society. The implication being, of course, that we need to reduce population growth, that we need targeted programs to do that. And indeed, there's a bunch of them, and many of them can be pretty equitable. Those that focus on family planning and education can have a lot of positive social impacts as well. Where does it stack up in terms of how likely it is to have an effect on overall emissions, though? Well, I think that this graph is pretty illustrative. So what this shows on the x-axis is population in billions. So you can see, for example, the width of each country shows roughly what its population is. China, for example, has a little over 1 billion. You can see that based on how wide the bar is. And on the y-axis, you have CO2 emissions per capita, right? So the cool thing about this graph is you can actually get total emissions by kind of by looking at the area within each box, right? So China has something like 5 tons per capita of emissions with 1.3 billion people. The area of this box tells you kind of what its total emissions are. But let's think about where population growth is happening and where people are kind of living, right? So you've got a lot of people, about 1 billion in Africa, without South Africa and Libya. You've got 1 billion in India, give or take. Another 500 million or so in the rest of Asia, Indonesia and Brazil, also pretty low in emissions overall, add another 500 million or so, right? But look at the overall emissions that those countries kind of contribute to. It's actually not all that much. The very places where population is growing the most have pretty low emissions overall. Where do you see high emissions? Well, the United States has pretty damn high emissions per capita. Europe has reasonably high ones, although some countries in Europe have much lower emissions per capita, and that's important to pay attention to. But overall, the places with high populations are really not the places that are, high populations and especially high population growth rates are not, by and large, the places that are most responsible for historic and present day emissions. And this, I suggest, is a strong argument for being circumspect about any argument that centers population control as a major strategy that we need to pursue imminently, a priority for dealing with climate change. And there's some other issues with that as well that we'll get to in a second. And just to remind you of that issue around GDP, the other kind of big assumption in global climate policy discussions is that we can't really have policies that try to decarbonize economies at the expense of GDP growth because they will be political non-starters. Like we saw, overall median earnings have kind of remained flat in the United States over time, even as GDP per capita has gone up and up and up. And as you all pointed out in class quite aptly, a lot of that discrepancy is because the benefits of GDP growth. That money tends to accrue to people that are already pretty well off. It tends to accrue to private profits rather than public goods, rather than workers' wages. And that gives us pause, I think, when we might want to discount policies that could apparently perhaps not try to maximize GDP growth or even contract GDP growth, but could distribute things in such a way that a lot of people would benefit, all of a sudden making it more politically viable. And the idea that these things aren't politically viable, it's also important to think about what makes them not politically viable. A policy that makes working people worse off, like the fuel tax in France that led to the yellow vest protests that we read about last week, may tend to spark certain types of reactions, the reactions that working people tend to deploy: protests, electoral politics, direct action, stuff that disrupts the economy pretty directly. On the other hand, policies that might threaten capital, might threaten profits, but don't really affect working people directly that much, might result in more money being spent on elections to influence the political process, in propaganda campaigns through the media, using the kind of well-funded apparatuses that companies that have high profits might have available, right? So another thing to keep in mind about where kind of messaging around this stuff is coming from. So, given these disparities, who is responsible for climate change? Should population be treated as a central problem for the environment? And what are the most promising avenues to address these issues? Well, like with everything else, there is a history here. So, this is a dude named Thomas Malthus. He was, quote unquote, according to one of his buddies who was also part of like the Royal Society or whatever, a gentleman of good family and independent means, certainly a friend of the emerging and growing imperial apparatus of England, and also a demographer and thinker. And what he pointed out in the late 18th century, as population was indeed starting to increase with industrialization, with urbanization, was that population seems to grow exponentially, whereas food production only grows linearly. And as a result of that, we're gonna hit a point, Malthus argued, where we can't feed everybody on Earth. And he thought that this was going to happen pretty darn soon, in the 18th century or something like that. Why did Malthus's predictions not come to pass? Well, the answer primarily lies in technology. There was technological innovations that Malthus did not account for. There was other stuff at play too, but technology had a big part to play in it. You may not have heard of this process, the Haber-Bosch process, but this diagram that you see here, and we're not going to talk about it in detail because I don't understand it in detail myself, had huge implications for humanity. Before the Haber-Bosch process for fixing nitrogen was developed in the 20th century, all the nitrogen that is usable for plants, that is usable for agriculture, that can be used as fertilizer, had to be taken from manure, had to be ultimately was fixed by lightning or fixed by bacteria that have enzymes that can take atmospheric nitrogen and convert it into ammonia or ammonium or some other form that plants can actually use and animals can eventually eat. This really changed everything. The Haber-Bosch process made it so that all of a sudden we could, as humans, use fossil fuel energy to drive a process of nitrogen fixation and generate huge amounts of fertilizer that can massively increase, at least in the short term or medium term, agricultural yields. You can see here that the overall nitrogen cycle on Earth changed pretty dramatically as a result of this process. In 1890, this was sort of the nitrogen cycle. Bacterial fixation was, I don't know what the units are here actually, but it doesn't really matter. You can sort of see how they stack up relatively. 15 on farms. Most of the fixation was actually in the wild through bacterial fixation, with lightning and fires doing a little bit of it too. By 1990, massive difference. Most, or the plurality of nitrogen fixation at least, if not the majority, was due to the Haber-Bosch process driven by humans. We disrupted or changed fundamentally one of the most kind of basic nutrient cycles on planet Earth. Yet another way that humans have massively altered the Earth's planetary biogeochemical dynamics. Other things were happening as well. Other things happened later in the 20th century. So fertilizer was present, yields were going up, but population continued to go up and up and up. And this person here in the lower left is a dude named Norman Borlaug. He's often known as kind of the father of dwarf wheat or the father of the so-called Green Revolution. The Green Revolution refers to a transformation in agricultural technology where hybrid crops that could grow, that could actually be produced multiple times a year, that could yield 2 crops per year rather than 1 or 3 rather than 2, started to proliferate. And all of a sudden, yields could just go up massively. So you can see here from 1960 on, yields continuing to go up and up and up. I'm sorry that there's no labels on the y-axis. That actually can be a little distorting a lot of the time. But what you can see is area remains relatively flat, but yield and production goes up. So with less area, with the same amount of area, all of a sudden a lot more staple crops can be produced. Now this has a whole host of political implications. What happens to farmers that were growing mixed use fields in different parts of the world? Well, a lot of different things, and we don't have time to get into all of that today. But this was pretty disruptive for a lot of people, and it also did indeed increase the overall amount of edible grains, edible staple grains that were being produced on the planet Earth. So we've got big technological changes that transform our ability to feed the planet. But there's still people that think that this is going to not be sustainable as population continues to grow. And one of the main kind of harbingers of, one of the main kind of people who insisted that there was still going to be a massive crisis, a so-called neo-Malthusian who took Thomas Malthus's ideas in the 18th century and said, okay, Malthus was wrong. We didn't see the collapse in the 18th century or even in the 19th century or 20th century, but now going forward, we are gonna hit our limits. So Paul Ehrlich wrote a book called The Population Bomb, which was hugely influential at the global level in influencing policymakers, in influencing the United Nations to really think about this. Now Ehrlich also had some problematic affiliations, very problematic affiliations. He and his wife Anne were part of the board of advisors to the Federation for American Immigration Reform, which was classified by the Southern Poverty Law Center as a hate group. He has had different ideas throughout his life about what the best approaches to this stuff was, but ultimately, he did tend to insist that population control needed to be a priority, and he tended to suggest that it was in the global south where population growth presented the greatest challenge for overall resources on Earth. Things like nitrogen, he argued, were going to be eroded as we put this stuff on our soils in monocultures and they got washed away. A consequence of the Green Revolution was that we have monocultures now that don't have the sort of symbioses with soil fungi and nitrogen-fixing bacteria, where multiple crops can hold soils together. Instead, we kind of rip up soils every year and replant the same crop and put chemical fertilizers on top of them, which then wash away and cause further downstream issues in water systems, etc. But ultimately what this does is it causes us to potentially lose productive soils, which can be a real issue going forward. Other people, not just Ehrlich, pointed out that there's other limiting factors as well. Phosphorus. Unlike nitrogen, we actually can't fix phosphorus. We have to mine it from rock. Phosphorus is another thing that we absolutely need to grow food. There is no substitute for phosphorus. It's an atom, it's an element that is fundamental to life. It's built into the backbone of DNA. Plants need it to do everything that they do. We need it to do everything that we do. And as phosphorus gets depleted from soils that get washed away into the oceans from kind of monoculture agricultural practices, we have to mine more of it. And this has big geopolitical implications, by the way, because this is kind of the global distribution of phosphorus. You see that there's a lot of it in Morocco, actually, and not a lot of it in most other places. Circling back to one of the very first things that we saw in this class, we're also pushing up against other planetary limits, potentially. Genetic diversity, ozone depletion, ocean acidification, fresh water use, climate change. Ehrlich and other neo-Malthusians argue that as population increases, all of these pressures necessarily become greater, perhaps intractably so, and that as a result of that, addressing overpopulation needs to be a priority. Of course, this is not necessarily consistent with what we just looked at, which is that, at least from an emissions standpoint, countries where population growth is the fastest tend to be contributing kind of the least to at least climate change. And also in some of these other areas as well. If you remember back to the graph that showed how the US has a particularly unsustainable diet that could not reasonably be extrapolated to everyone else on Earth, you can see that it's not just about climate change, but a lot of these other areas as well. So population growth is declining, but some would argue not fast enough. The neo-Malthusians would argue not fast enough. What are some of the solutions that they have put forward? Population controls, strict limits on how many kids people can have, policy disincentives. There's a famous system in China called the Hukou system, which is associated with the kind of one-child policy, which provides disincentives for people to migrate to cities, provides disincentives for people to have children, provides disincentives for people with children to go to cities because they can't get healthcare, stuff like that. Family planning, contraception, other types of stuff like that. But there's also a much more fraught, a much more ghoulish past to population control strategies, a much more explicitly racist and white supremacist history that these types of patterns of thought have had. In the United States, there's a long history of forced sterilizations rooted in eugenics as an idea. This map right here shows states that had forced sterilizations, eugenical sterilizations in the United States, and the number of operations. It was pretty widespread, right? So you can see that it was only much later that they stopped doing this. And these are policies that targeted Native Americans, indigenous people, African Americans, people with mental people with different mental abilities, and people that were deemed by scientists for all kinds of reasons, often racist reasons, often ableist reasons, to not be worthy of the sovereignty over their own bodies to choose whether or not to have families, to reproduce. In Puerto Rico is another place where forced sterilizations happened for a long time in the 20th century, up until even the late 20th century. It's a part of the United States' history that you may have heard about, but you also may not have heard about. And I would really encourage you to look into it because it is a deeply important part of the country's history when it comes to racism and white supremacy, and it's linked very much to these discussions around population. So racism undergirds these solutions, and it has undergirded them historically. It is a racism that in the context of climate change shifts responsibility away from those most responsible for the problem. Paul Ehrlich himself, in The Population Bomb, that 1968 bestseller, illustrated overpopulation with a scene of a Delhi slum seen through a taxi window, a mob with a quote-unquote hellish aspect, full of people eating, people washing, people thrusting their hands through the taxi window, begging. He goes on, people defecating, people. He confessed to being afraid that he and his wife would never reach their hotel, and reported that on that night he came to understand overpopulation at an emotional level, personally. Now, a question that I would pose to you is, what do you think the total fertility rate might be in a place like Delhi? We know that there's a very high total fertility rate, is something like 4 or 5, where there's massive population growth. 2 is kind of the replacement rate, 2.1, anything less than 2.1 means that the population growth rate is declining. Take a second and actually take a guess. What do you think the total fertility rate is in Delhi? Give you like 5 seconds to think of a number. Okay, so it turns out that the total fertility rate in Delhi is 1.6. In Bombay, it is 1.4. These are actually lower than London, where the average is 1.72. Density can be good. If you're walking, if you're close to where you need to go to work, if you're close to the places that you go for community activities, your emissions can be a lot lower. Urban density can be a great thing for climate. And yet, these types of images that you see here are often the ones that we associate with overpopulation. And I would really encourage you to take this data and this information to reconsider how you might react to these images, and reconsider how you might react to these types of conversations. People in cities everywhere actually tend to have fewer people than their compatriots in rural areas. The average woman in Kenya has 4.3 children, whereas those living in the capital, Nairobi, have just 2.7, for example. So there's huge variation even within countries that have high population growth, and a lot of that has to do with urbanization. Now, in the context of something like the coronavirus, where different countries are taking different measures, I personally can't help but also notice that very densely populated countries that might have conditions that we have been culturally and even aesthetically sort of trained to think of as being not great for disease spread or hygiene, have had excellent responses to the crisis. Vietnam controlled the spread of the coronavirus very quickly, and in a way that I think is really, really impressive. Other countries have had similarly good results. And I think this just kind of underscores that policy and collective action can happen in lots of different places under lots of different economic and demographic conditions. And it would be a mistake, I think, to reductively think that places with high population growth rate or even high population densities are somehow less able to respond to global crises, less able to act in solidarity with others around the world, or less able to deal with climate change. And again, wealth, not concentrated in these places. Wealth really is concentrated in the global north, in places that are not commonly associated with these types of images, not commonly associated with a place like India, right? So here's, again, India, and here's another graph that just shows the variation of birth and population growth rates across the country. You can see that there's huge areas in the South, again, largely associated with female literacy, with the education of girls and women, with family planning education. There's a lot of other explanations. People will talk about kind of deeper histories of matriarchy in the culture in South India. But for whatever combination of reasons, this shows us that there's a lot of variation even in countries that might be thought of kind of homogeneously in international discourse. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. So what actually shapes the future of this curve? We know something about the distribution of wealth. We know something about where population is growing quickly. We also know that there's a lot of talk about how dealing with climate change requires us to think about population, about GDP, and about emissions per unit of GDP and the carbon intensity of those emissions simultaneously. So an important question then is, how does development, how does wealth associate with total fertility? How does GDP growth associate with that? Does developing countries with a focus on GDP necessarily help to reduce population growth? And the answer from the data that we have available is not really. GDP does not seem to cut, GDP increases does not seem to automatically cut population growth. What this graph here shows is that there's quite a range of population growth rates across levels of GDP, right? So you can have pretty high GDP countries that still have a pretty big range of total fertility. Similarly, for lower GDP per capita countries, you have an extremely big range, right? So clearly there's other policies that really make a difference. And Indeed, it is female education that seems to be the strongest correlator in a lot of these places. So that tells us that there's ways to connect uh, social policies that attend to gendered oppressions in a way that doesn't have any of these draconian components and authoritarian components, but instead offers material benefits to people, offers education to people, and nevertheless is also good for the climate. Right? So between these two graphs, I think that what we can see is that there are a variety of solutions that might involve thinking about population, but not in a way that is hitched to its problematic legacies, and thinking about GDP and thinking about the distribution of resources. Again, something that we're going to circle back to and talk about in more detail when we talk about inequality. All right. Oops. Bear with me a second here. Okay, so one of the things that we've read about is something called Jevons paradox. And this is useful to take a quick look at before we wrap up here, because it helps us to understand the types of policies that might make sense given the type of analysis that we do. And basically what Jevons paradox suggests is that efficiency, quote unquote, doesn't always lead to lower impacts. And we see this in some of the situations that we've already looked at. We saw it perhaps in the yellow vest protests, for example. Essentially what it means is that if demand is kind of inelastic, if there's something that people really need a lot of, making it cheaper doesn't necessarily change as much as you might want the amount of the thing that people consume. In essence, if people are fundamentally structurally dependent on oil or gas to drive, if people are fundamentally structurally dependent on eating meat because it's the only thing that's available for some reason, if people are fundamentally structurally dependent on having to go a long way to get to work or having to live far away from work because there's no housing available close to where they work, increasing prices, taxes, for example, are not necessarily going to be the best way to have a huge impact on what people can do. And they might actually cause backlash of the sort that we saw in the yellow vest protests. And in the context of a growing population, I think this is especially important to keep in mind. It tells us certain things about what makes sense for people. It helps us to think, circling back, about what types of policies that we've already covered are likely or not likely to run into kind of this Jevons paradox. So I'd encourage you to think about whether or not protected areas, pollution controls, bans on certain types of activities like fracking are more or less likely to run into these issues around making people pay higher costs without having an alternative to pursue compared to fuel taxes that might not be equitably distributed. Especially when we see, given that we're seeing such an unequal contribution to overall global emissions, both between countries and also within countries. Right? So you might see more of those types of issues coming up with certain forms of taxes than you might with certain types of pollution controls. Now that said, certain types of controls on certain types of regulations can potentially also run into these issues. So an important thing to think about is if we're trying to reduce carbon emissions, for example, is it possible to have a regulation that doesn't just deprive people of something that they need, but also provides an alternative? Is it possible to have taxes or subsidies for things that we do want people to do, respectively, that avoids the issue, those types of issues as well, right? Is it possible to have green jobs programs, public transit funding, and public utilities in a way that benefits lots of people and doesn't penalize people, especially those people that may not have contributed that much to emissions in the first place, especially if we're deploying or seeing these types of policies deployed in the global south in countries that really don't have high emissions. It's really important to think about who's going to be benefiting and who's going to potentially be paying costs, and thinking about what might be the most just approach given everything that we've just discussed about population. All right. And I think it's especially crucial to think about, once again, and circling back to the kind of model that we started to explore before break, how the policies that we do have in place came to be. How is it that we, for example, came to build so much dependence on cars for transportation? How is it that we came to have such an energy-dependent diet in the United States? Why is it that we have such high emissions despite having relatively low population growth? And again, I can't really stress enough that this has everything to do with the political process. It has everything to do with the fact that different actors, from small farmers, communities, urban workers, students, teachers, environmentalists, different kinds of private firms, are always and constantly agitating for policies that serve them at all levels of government, at all levels of political negotiation. And again, in the context of the pandemic that we're dealing with right now, once again, we're seeing lots of different responses on the table that would benefit different people and benefit different groups of people or different numbers of people. The Trump administration has chosen as a way to address, as part of the way that it wants to address the pandemic, to provide large sums of money to shale oil companies that are losing profits as the global economy slows down. And they did this before investing in strategies that would protect workers in cities that potentially are precarious, people that can't pay rent. We're now starting to see the needle move on that a little bit as we see different groups of people come together. We're starting to see small business owners and workers actually share an interest in shoring up their workers' wages because that would benefit everybody in the long run. We're starting to see some realignment of these coalitions around this crisis that we're facing right now. But I do think that understanding the distribution of impact and consumer choice across the world is vital as we think about the types of policy options that might serve us best in the future, that might help us to have an international approach to climate policy that attends to historical injustice and also promotes justice going forward into the future. And I would just close by saying that there's a bunch of different types of options that we have on the table for dealing with climate and other crises. And there is one specific type of climate solution that is being advanced by certain political interests, by the right in the United States, by other formations elsewhere, known as walls between countries, putting up boundaries and borders and barriers between people, between communities. And I think that walls are among the most cynical possible solutions to climate change. There are those who claim that with the impending climate catastrophes of the 21st century, perhaps even exacerbated potentially by pandemic conditions, the best solution is to wall ourselves off. And for those with relative privilege, including those who contribute the most to environmental degradation, to bar free exchange with others. And then there are other people out there who are saying, in no uncertain terms, that no, we have enough resources for everyone to have a good life. We have enough resources for everyone to have a dignified life, for a future that is sustainable, for a future that is even urban. So I think that it's really critical to think about who is advocating for which vision of the future, not just which policy instrument in the short term, but what type of world we're trying to build in the long run that deals with and understands some of these deep inequalities and seeks to address them in a way that is positive and in a way that is humane. The movements out there continue to do this work, and even as we remain isolated physically from one another, I hope that we can find ways to plug in to this stuff that's happening around the world, to continue to move forward in humane, productive, just, and ecological directions. Okay, so there's places to ask questions and have discussions on the Moodle forum associated with this. Look forward to being in touch.